Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Derek Hansen. Derek is a National Strength and Conditioning Association certified strength and conditioning specialist that has been working with athletes in speed, strength, and power sports since 1988. Originally working with track and field athletes, Derek expanded his services to assist athletes in all sports with an emphasis on speed development. He has since worked with some of the top performers in the world as a coach and a consultant, including Olympic medalists, world record holders, Canadian national team athletes, professional sports organizations, and professional athletes from numerous sports. Locally, Derek has produced some of the top sprinters in British Columbia and continues to work with some of the fastest athletes in various sports. I've known Derek personally for a little over a year now. We met at the Physical Preparation Summit in Indianapolis, where Derek was the featured speaker. So it was a 2-day seminar, and there was an entire day devoted specifically to Derek. And even though Derek was the headliner, I think he asked more questions and was more curious than anybody else in attendance. Derek is one of those people who, as a coach, an educator, and a communicator, is able to take very complex ideas and simplify them without watering down the material. And I think you'll see we talk about Derek's role as a consultant for various sports organizations, and he's typically brought into these organizations to speak about very specific issues, but he also recognizes that to be a better specialist, you have to be a generalist, and Derek is definitely somebody who appreciates the global and the integrated nature of even some of the specific problems that people encounter in the world of sport. Derek, thanks for taking the time to join me. This is the first time that I'm recording one of these podcasts in person. It's nice to do it in my living room on the couch, having you right next to me instead of over Skype. So, as some people here may know, you work primarily now as a consultant for different professional sports organizations. And before we get into the details about what you specifically do for these organizations, I wanted to ask you a broader question now, which is, why do you think it's important for any organization to have an outsider like you audit its performance?
Well, thanks for having me, Doug. I've had a chance to spend a number of weeks with you, which is great. We've had just interactions at conferences, events, and some talk over Skype and the internet, which is great. But to have being in person with somebody is just the best, because now you can kind of feel the vibe, get into more in-depth conversations, and then see them the next day and ask more. So this is great. As far as this idea that you're going to bring somebody in external, I mean, just as from a total humility side, is that I just think it's good for people to get the opinion of people external or outside of your sort of domain, because everybody's perspective is different. And when you're in, I mean, as you know, when you're within sort of a group or an organization, things become very, closed, and your perspective is way different. So having somebody come in and say, hey, I noticed this, I've done it this way before, maybe that'll work for you. I think it's very enlightening, I guess is the word. And it just, if you have the sort of the openness to go, yeah, I want to hear a different point of view. I have the security to, take somebody's other point of view and integrate it with maybe some things that I'm already doing. I think it's very valuable. So, and being an external person, I think you and I, when we work with teams, understand that there could be some apprehension on the part of the people within the organization. You bring somebody in, maybe they're not as receptive as you and I, or maybe they don't have the thickest skin as you and I. So I think as a person coming from the outside, you have to tread lightly. You're being brought in as an expert, but you don't want to come off as an expert, I guess, sometimes. Yeah. And you want to just be, hey, I'm a regular dude. I'm just kind of checking things out, and wherever I can help, great. So that's how I approach it. I try to keep a very, very open mind. I try to be helpful, but not overly, prescriptive or critical in those situations.
Yeah, and you and I have had a lot of conversations about how sometimes being a better generalist can make you a better specialist, and having diversity of thought and difference of opinion as a way to see things through a broader lens, which ultimately can make you a better specialist. I remember when I was in the military, my job was primarily rescue, even though there was a tactical and an offensive element to that. And we had our own tactics when we would surround, let's say, a helicopter crash site, but our tactics were more medically oriented. And then we took a course with it was a civilian run course, but it was composed of primarily members from a different special operations unit who had retired. And when they kind of audited our tactics, they said, even though you guys are ultimately, providing extrication and medical interventions, you're initially the way that you stabilize or secure the crash site isn't offensive enough. You need to almost approach it like we would approach a target, much more aggressively, because you don't know if someone's setting up a trap or if you're being lured into something. And the light bulb went off where it's the medical part doesn't start until the scene's really secure, but we didn't have an offensive enough mindset, because even if people are well-intentioned, they can almost drink too much of their own Kool-Aid, regardless of, like I said, how having the best intentions at heart. So having that outside perspective, immediately changed our perspective, and we changed our tactics immediately, and we still were doing the same job at the end of the day, but albeit with some feedback from a group that allowed us to do our specialized job a little bit better. And I think that's effectively what you're trying to do with some of these organizations. So segueing into what you actually do, because consultant can kind of be a very broad and mysterious term. Generally, what are teams bringing you in to do, or what aspects of the performance program do you tend to audit? Or is it more broad?
Usually it's going to be the performance side. So, in professional sports, things are very challenging now because there's not a lot of time to get the work done. So you have very small windows, whether it's just preseason. Some professional leagues can't do off-season training with the players. So maybe you're talking about once you get into preseason and in season, what are some things you can do in very discrete amounts? So I come in and try to say, look, this is where I think you can get the most bang for your buck, and this is how I would progress it, knowing that you're not doing this all the time. So I think some of the time, I get brought in because not only am I maybe an expert in something like speed, but I think I'm recognized as somebody who's very practical, that understands each sport and each league and the circumstances around their collective bargaining agreement. And if you understand those limitations, then you have to be more precise, and you actually have to be more of a specialist, because if you come in saying I know how to do this, this, and this, it kind of muddles everything, and you don't really get good at anything. And so that's the one area, the performance side, speed oriented. How do we integrate speed with weights? A lot of people seem very comfortable, or they think they're very comfortable doing weightlifting and strength training, not so comfortable on the speed side, so in the running mechanics. So that's something that I'll be brought in to comment on and see if I can dovetail with what they're already doing. The other part of it is more sort of remedial and rehab, return to play oriented. So it would be a specific injury like a hamstring injury or a slew of hamstring injuries, sometimes related to knee, because I think there's a connection between hamstring and knee. But in both cases, we'll go back to how do we get them better by introducing good movement mechanics. So maybe that's the common thread. The common thread is I have an understanding and an expertise in how to move, at high speed. How does this relate to whether it's performance or rehab? So
yeah. And then one of the interesting things about being a consultant is that your primary purpose is to provide the team with information or options, and then they're ultimately responsible for implementing that information. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, where it's not always knowledge that's the limiting factor, but some of the organizational, logistical, or behavioral constraints that would preclude an organization from implementing some of the things that you might suggest. So what are some of the things or what are some of the challenges that you've had teams tell you, that different barriers to maybe implementing some of the ideas that you're suggesting, that teams have confided in you?
Well, the very common one is that there's disharmony within the organization. So these people aren't talking to these people, and I was brought in by one group of those people, right? So, and they tell you, well, we don't really talk much to these people. We don't integrate well. the front office doesn't really know what's going on here. And so right away you find that there's these systemic issues that will negatively impact what you're trying to achieve. So the way I usually broach the topic is I say, like, ideally I'd like to do this. Now I understand that this may not necessarily work well. So let's say hamstring rehab, brought in by performance staff to do hamstring rehab. There's a medical implication there. There's a rehab, where you might be stepping on people's toes. So I would say, like, as a strength and conditioning professional, when you have the athlete, you do this. Well, I may have knowledge on, maybe soft tissue therapy or other things that can be done in a clinical setting. I may say, I would talk to your medical staff about things that they could do to support what I would recommend you do. And I'm very careful about it. It's sort of like when I remember one time I had somebody come over to my house to look at, the gutters or something. And so the guy, like carpenters and home repair guys are kind of jack of all trades too. So I brought in a specialist to look at, my gutters. And of course he comes in and says, yeah, no, I can do this there. By the way, I noticed the guy that did the grout on your chimney did a shitty job, right? And so right there you're like, right? Like, okay, so you just badmouth my chimney guy, and when he could have, and then he said something to the effect of, I could do a better job. So that kind of turned me off. I mean, he could have pointed out that deficiency in the work a little more subtly, and I could have said, oh yeah, I didn't really notice that. Could you recommend somebody, right? And that's a better way to close the deal than to badmouth somebody. So that experience has now made me think more about how I deal with it. So if I see something where it's, there might be something egregious happening somewhere else, I rather than say, wow, that's really bad, like, you want me to help you with that too? I'll say, in this other organization I worked for, they had a very similar situation, and this is how they handled it, and then maybe that'll lead to some other conversation, or maybe me getting involved or referring somebody else. So, I really think, these are people in jobs, and that's their, that they have a stake in that. And if you are not careful in the way you propose solutions, I think it can come back to bite you. So, I don't know. I'm very, like we talk about, I'm very insecure about certain things. So I recognize that other people may be insecure. So I kind of build that into my delivery, that you don't want to be shocked or surprised by what I recommend. So maybe I do a bit of a soft sell on that side.
Yeah, so you're kind of suggesting that every organization has a hierarchy with some predetermined roles, and even when you're brought in as a consultant, it's presumably to discuss one thing. But what you're saying is that even if you're brought in to, let's say, improve speed, if you see some organizational or systemic issues, you almost have a professional or even an ethical obligation to discuss those things with the performance staff, albeit in a way that's responsible, tactful, and respectful. So you're basically saying that you can't separate all these different elements of performance. So you need to kind of stay in your lane, but also in a way that you're aware of everything else that's going on and some of the other things that are going to limit your success as a consultant, and then the performance staff success in implementing some of your suggestions. So I guess communication being one of the key things, and the delivery of your message. I mean, what have you done, throughout your career to learn how to become a better communicator? Is it things that you've read, or is it just kind of trial and error and having made mistakes? Because I think it's something we all struggle with, right?
Yeah, honestly, it's going to be the trial and error part. And I think that while you kind of know that you're getting better at these things, but you're always going to stumble a bit. And, you and I both being married guys, I think that helps, where you're like, hey, this is going really well. I figured it out. The relationship is, we've been together this long, and then you stick your foot in your mouth somehow, and then, the apple cart goes over. So, just be aware of yourself, and, that you could always be a little better, I think is really important. And, I think you and I share that philosophy in terms of, we could always be better. So the way we conduct ourselves will reflect that. And I think that's how we do get better. And it's not that we'll never be happy with ourselves, but it's just more of a philosophical approach.
Yeah, I think that the difficult part is these organizations are bringing you in for answers, so to speak. And so you want to be kind of direct and definitive in what you're recommending. But then if you're too direct and too definitive and too honest, then that can also work against you as well. So I think that's just the really tricky part. Like you said, I don't know if there's a perfect way to do that, and if there's like a school of communication or whatever. But I think having that kind of that tact and being able to read a room and recognize, because I'm sure there are different staffs that you can be even more direct with, right? Like there are probably some staffs that maybe have a little bit a culture, a little bit more transparency, and people are honest, and maybe there's more of less of a vertical hierarchy and more of an environment where people can speak more freely. There are probably some organizations that are a lot more rigid. So have you seen differences in how organizations communicate, and has that kind of affected maybe how you would deliver your message within those organizations?
Absolutely. And you and I both being fans of stand-up comedy, I think you really have to read the room, right? Like you go in there and you lay out the first joke, and the rest of your set is probably set up by how that goes over and, the people's reactions. And I think if you go into a situation where you're working with a team and they're at the bottom of the league, there's one of two things that can happen. They can be very receptive because they want to get better. And that might be a newer staff that's entry into the league has been working, they cleared out the staff and they brought in all new people because they're at the bottom and we want to move up. They're going to be more receptive. Then if you have a team that's at the bottom of the league, but they have all their existing staff for the last 10 years, probably a very defensive group. And at the same thing on the other end, I've been brought in where teams are doing really well. And, they may want to hear more about how they can maintain that success or even get better. Whereas you may go in there and they're at the top. They're like, hey man, we know we're doing well. We've won the last, this many championships. And they're just kind of bringing you in for lip service to say like, hey, yeah, you're doing a good job, guys. So it's really, you got to be really careful, I guess, and just assess. You don't want to come on too strong in the beginning, and then you're going off their lead. So if they say, we want to learn more about this, or what can you help us with this, and then you just kind of pull up the slack. But if you come and say, I've examined your organization and this is what I would do, like absolutely, positively, I know how to fix you guys, then that's really, going to set you up, I think. So
now, if I'm not mistaken, most of the time that you're invited to consult with an organization, it's the performance staff that's inviting you. Have you ever been in a different situation where maybe the front office brought you in to evaluate the performance staff? Because I feel like that creates a whole other dynamic where now the performance staff is going to look at you like, oh, well, here's the guy the front office brought in to be the white knight. And now if you're trying to audit that staff, I mean, if I was in that situation and I was working for an organization, I would probably be much more guarded about what I shared with that consultant, because that guy could ultimately be recommending that, that I lose my job, or, I mean, there's a lot at stake, and it could lead to a very negative professional outcome if you're on the receiving end of that auditing. So have you been in that situation? And whether you have or you haven't, how would you handle that? Because you obviously need to earn the trust of the people that you're auditing so they can be transparent. But if you're not being brought in by the performance staff, I would imagine it's much more difficult to have an honest conversation with them.
Yeah, I have not had the opportunity being brought in by the administrative staff or the front office staff. So I can't really speak to that from experience, but I would think that if that happened, you're exactly right. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to meet with the staff that you're evaluating and try to set them at ease a bit and say like, hey, how are things going, guys? I just want to hear, from each individual what you think is going on and what you perceive as some of the issues. I'm not here to judge. I'm just here to offer, my opinion. And, maybe you do that in a setting that's less confrontational, like, hey, let's go for beers, let's just go talk, and, let's try to take the edge off and find a way to connect with them, maybe on something that's not related to the business, it's not related to the sports, like, hey, you got a couple of kids? Yeah, I got 3 kids too, and I just find that that's a better way to get people to open up and, like you said, become transparent, because if they perceive that you're in there for reasons only related to, the business side, I think, they're going to be tight. They're not going to offer, maybe the truth, or they might, change the truth a little bit, or may point the finger at other people, which doesn't really help you get to the root of the problem. So yeah, I just, we all understand. We've all been on the other end of evaluations, and it's always easier. Like even when you go to the doctor's office, right? If the guy, doesn't crack a grin, and you got to get your prostate examined, and he's not joking around, it makes it a lot more difficult, honestly. Like if the guy's like, "Hey, how's it going?" Right? And you're at ease, right? It makes everything more easy. It greases the wheels, pardon the pun. But I think it's the same for any sort of corporate, or organizational evaluation. Come on, hey, let's just talk here. We want to get to the bottom of things. We want to provide solutions. We're not here to point fingers. And I think, that's how I would handle it. I don't know if that's how it's done by others, but at least that's my perspective.
Yeah, and I think regardless of who's bringing in the consultant, whether it's the front office or the performance staff, it's an opportunity for the organization to get better in all areas. So I think I would liken it more to a marriage counselor than like a lawyer. Like if you're on trial for something, you're going to hire a defense lawyer to defend you. But I think in these situations, it's more like a marriage counselor where, just because like you or I hires a marriage counselor, it's not that marriage counselor's professional duty to take your side. It's to take in all the information and try to find the best solution. So even if a front office member brings in a consultant, presumably to find flaws with the performance staff, that consultant, I would argue, also has a professional duty to maybe tell the front office how that executive is making things harder for the performance staff. So it works both ways. So even if, when you're going in there and the performance staff is like, oh, what's this guy? This guy is here so we can, he can criticize us in front of the management. You can go in and say, look, like, I'm here to make things better for the organization. So how can I make your job easier? I'm really just here, even though it's to audit the performance staff. You can't separate the performance staff from the rest of the organization. So what organizational or systemic barriers have you guys encountered? Because maybe it's not that your lack of competence. Maybe it's just that it could be something where you're practicing too much, or you wish your travel schedules. There's so many variables that come into play, but I think that you have to establish that very early on and just make it very definitive that you're not there to take sides. You're there to audit the entire program, regardless of who brings you on. So anything kind of to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would love, you and I would both love to be invited to evaluate things on an organizational level. And we've talked about this because I think both of us have been in scenarios where we understand that it doesn't matter what we tell the staff we think they should do. There's barriers, and you're not going to optimize those types of things until you address some of these other issues. And people may say, well, do you have a management degree, or have you done, are you a human resources kind of guy? And I would say yes, I don't have formal training in it, but usually that's the problem. And I think, we've talked about this too. When we go in, I'm not saying you're not doing that exercise right. You're not, doing this many reps. I'm usually saying, I'm trying to evaluate them on their just general philosophy and their attitude. And so if they have an open attitude and are willing to learn and are willing to make adjustments and are very aware of what they're doing and what the result, the feedback that the athletes are giving them, that's a better scenario. That's something that you can work with. But if I've written training plans for professional teams and I give it to them, I'm not certain that they implement them at all, or even part, or even do it properly. So if that human side isn't working and they're not receptive and they want to learn, it doesn't matter what we hand them on paper. Just like we talk about with athletes, like you can give them, here, do this. But if there's not a framework around that and an attitude around it, things are just going to fall apart. So, maybe the people side is probably more important in terms of our contribution, or at least setting a context where in order for you to maximize what I'm giving you, we have to have this on the people side. Like, people have to be able to change. People have to be able to be spontaneous and work on the fly and be adaptable.
Yeah, and I think, just having had conversations with you, I think in an ideal world, we would both like to, if we were consulting with an organization, to be able to address members of the organization outside the performance staff. But obviously time is very finite, right? So if you're brought in for 48 hours to audit a performance staff, you're not going to have access to the GM and the head coach for those 48 hours. I'm just thinking out loud. And that's one of the cool things about doing this in person is maybe, at least when you're going to finally debrief the performance staff, maybe the actual debrief where you come up with your action plan, maybe that needs to be done with, at least a member of the coaching staff or a member of the front office. If not the GM or the president, maybe just somebody who's influential, because if you're giving advice to the performance staff, it's rare that the performance staff does these things in a vacuum. So maybe the head coach says, "Oh, I saw you brought in that guy. What did he have to say?" Instead of that information coming secondhand through an intermediary, maybe it's like, "Hey, for this to really work, I would like to have 10 minutes for the final debrief with a member of the coaching staff and a member of the front office." It doesn't have to be the most influential member of the coaching staff or the front office, but just so that there's somebody from all those parties being represented, because like you've always said, you can't differentiate the performance side from some of the organizational aspects. And let's say you're being brought into just for speed preparation or sprint preparation. You might put the team on what you think is the best program, in the league. But if people don't comply with that program because of the collective bargaining agreement and some of the off-season restrictions, now if the head coach is assuming, let's say, that everyone did the program, but maybe everybody didn't, and now the first day of practice, everyone's kind of going all out, and the coach is trying to make up for all the lost time from the summer when not everyone is equally prepared to do some of those things. And so someone ultimately has to tell the coach, like, "Hey, even though we've implemented this program, not everybody actually did it, so we have to figure out a way to not put people at risk." So again, I'm thinking out loud, but do you think that there's, well, in an ideal world, how would you handle it as far as, like, you obviously can't have the ear of the executive staff or the coaching staff the entire time that you're there auditing, but how much time do you think would be necessary to really come up with an effective plan so you're being an advocate for both the performance staff and the organization as a whole?
Honestly, I would like to have working sessions with the staff that are going to implement exactly what I'm recommending, right? So if that's the performance staff, if there's the rehab staff, great. But at some point, I think there should be an interaction between, we meet with them, and then to come up with our findings, the GM comes in or the head coach comes in and says, "Okay, this is what we've talked about as a group. We want to articulate this to you guys and let you understand what we've been working on. And then I want the performance staff to identify some of the issues that we talked about and what they would be on board with, based on my recommendations in front of the head coach, in front of the GM, so that, and then I would want to know, are they saying the same things in my private session with them as that they are now saying in front of the head coach and the GM? Because if they're not, that's a freaking problem, right? If they go, "Yeah, this is what we discussed, and we would like to, work with you as the GM and the coaching staff to resolve some of these things." Now, okay, it's out in the open. But there's been so many situations where I've just worked with performance staff, and I know that there's no talk or feedback to the people above them about what we've discussed, and they're trying to implement it in a vacuum, which, as you know, doesn't work. Because if the coach has a different agenda and the GM doesn't give a shit, then there's going to be a problem in the long run. And that's, I'm seeing that now with a bunch of different organizations where, it looked like it was going to be okay, but there wasn't that transparency and there wasn't that integration of philosophies. And even today, like, I had a good meeting with former NFL strength coaches who was very successful, had a lot of Super Bowl rings. And I was asking him about, things like how many times do you practice on an artificial surface versus a natural surface? Because if you just practice on a natural surface all the time, trying to preserve people, and then you play on an artificial surface, that's a shock. Like, it changes the dynamics of how people move and how, the eccentric load on people. So you have to try to mix it up. And I said, that's a perfect example where you have to, and he said, well, if we practice on turf, then the guys complain to get sore because the load's higher. And so I said, well, then you have to talk to the head coach and say, if we're on turf, we have to shorten up our periods. We have to adjust for that surface because we want the exposure without the disbenefits. And he said, well, that's difficult. That's going to be difficult. And right there, that's the problem, is that if I have that discussion with the strength coach and we're both on board, it doesn't matter, because the person that really should be on board should be the head coach, right? So, but that's a perfect panacea of an organization that we're talking about. I don't know if that exists yet. If it does, I'd like to see it,
Yeah, and you and I have both talked to Fergus Conley on separate occasions, and one of the things I appreciate about him and his book is that he talks about how the strategic and the tactical objectives should drive the performance questions. And so I think a lot of times, like, head coach, sport coaches or executives look at the performance staff as kind of a burden. It's like, oh, these guys are telling me to, instead of flying out the night of a game, we have to fly out the next night so that guys can be recovered. And now this guy is saying we shouldn't run too much in practice because it might, get in the way, interfere with their recovery.
Yeah.
And so now, but the reality is, like, I think that if these questions are framed appropriately, the performance staff is supposed to help augment strategy at an organizational level, and so that they should be the ones driving the questions. Which is why even if a front office or the coaching staff brings in someone like you to audit the performance staff, it should be to help them. It's not to so anybody like loses their jobs. But I think that someone like you, where you could be really valuable if you had the platform, is you could educate the coaching staff or the front office on how the performance staff could better help them. Because I think that any NFL coach, as an example, would like to have faster players. Like, how would that change your offensive menu and your play calling menu if you had guys that were faster? I think everybody wants that. But I think that, because everybody speaks different languages, and this is where people, like, communication, like you said, is huge. Strength and conditioning coaches and performance professionals often, I think, sometimes fixate too much on physiology, and they speak their own language, and not a language the coach understands at a tactical level or that the GM understands at a strategic level. And so I think that, at some point, a consultant like you has to have the ears of all these different people to just so you can put everybody at ease and let everybody know that, hey, you guys are actually all on the same page. You're just using different words. And now how can we ask the right questions so that every element of the organization is being used appropriately? But I think, like you said, if these things are happening in a vacuum, then you'll never achieve the kind of harmony that's required for these things to work. And then it's like you were brought in, but now your action plan can't be implemented because of something that's a little bit more strategic in nature. So I wanted to transition into, you've been doing this for quite a while, and I'm sure that you kind of see some of the same patterns, even as far as the physical stuff goes. So what are some of the things you think could go on at a grassroots level that maybe would minimize the need for someone like you to come in and implement some of these things? Because I think that people assume that professional athletes have elite performance habits, elite nutrition habits, that maybe they even, they're elite as far as like their running technique goes. So I've seen you work with people who run, 4.340s, and you're still like, wow, like they're still leaving a lot of potential on the table mechanically. And people, we often assume that because these people are so good at what they do that we shouldn't touch them. But I think that you're not afraid to intervene and make people even better. And a lot of times, even at the highest level, you're seeing it's very simple fixes and simple plans that you're implementing. So what do you think are some things that, even before people get to pro sports, that could be implemented to, I don't want to say make you obsolete, but maybe reserve people like you so that you're actually consulting on things that are really difficult and require expertise, and not on some of these more simple type interventions?
Yeah, I think I'm always careful to not go into a project or an assignment to make people perfect. And I think, especially when you're working with younger people, I'm very careful not to go in with that as my goal. I want to create a bit of some structure so that, and some expectations about what I want them to achieve, but I like to give them some margin or, some room to explore some creativity too. So I do think that a lot of people succeed in spite of, whatever they're taught. They just have natural ability. Maybe they have an exceptional level of desire, and they overcome a lot of their deficiencies. So, I want a bit of that struggle. I want a bit of that hunger, but I also want to provide them with the means to, take that and turn themselves into much better human beings. So, I just think we should be able to. The information should be readily accessible. Now, you and I have talked about, how can we do that in an online way? How can we make that information accessible so people can, take it and be better? But at the same time, we don't want it to be a robotic process where you absolutely have to do this to be better. And that's that fine line I'm walking right now, is how much information do I give people? How much do I let them kind of, flail around on their own a bit? Because I think that's an important part of it. And just like some of the athletes you introduced me to on the weekend, you can only take them so far, and then they have to kind of do it themselves, right? And that's a huge part of it, and that's what's going to make them more resilient. Pardon the pun.
Thank you.
More adaptable. But at the same time, you have kind of given them a little shove, and you said, okay, let's try, this is the direction I think you should go. And quite honestly, some people may not choose to take your advice and just kind of continue to flail a bit, and that's fine. I don't take that personally anymore, because there's a lot of people who have, not taken my advice. And, just like the comedian, you got to go find your audience and the people who will laugh at your jokes. If you try to make everybody laugh at your jokes, it ain't going to happen. So, I just think you and I want to be providers of very good information, and then put it out there so that people who are really enthusiastic about getting good information can take it and try it with themselves. Because that perfect model, I don't think, is ever going to be achieved. But, we have to do the best we can.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you've been in New York quite a bit the last few weeks, so I've had the privilege of watching you coach some of the athletes that I work with, and I was amazed at how basic some of your interventions were, and you were able to identify some technique issues that I'd struggled in resolving with basically three drills, but your emphasis is on the execution of those drills and doing them really well, and then interspersing it with running and just kind of going back and forth. And you're admittedly and unapologetically a tinkerer, which it's the true art of coaching. But like I said, what you're doing really, it's for the most part, it's very basic, and it's like we've made things like speed preparation so mysterious. And I think it was helpful watching you, because you really demystified that process for me. And so even people at a very high level still need to do these basic drills. But I don't like presenting things as dichotomous, because I know that it's not an either or. But it seems like the way that the field of sports preparation is going now is, I think it's become overly sophisticated, overly analytical, overly technical. So how do we reconcile these two things, where I think that even at the highest level, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit, both behaviorally and then just in terms of basic movement execution. But we also don't want to be dinosaurs, right? Like, we have all these new technologies that are coming onto the market, and I think if we're asking the right questions and we know what to measure, they can be very helpful. And we were even talking before we started recording, and you kind of mentioned that you basically want the technology to corroborate what you're seeing with your eyes. So how do you kind of manage this particular aspect of the field, where I think there's always this rift between, like, okay, the art of coaching and then the sports scientist. I don't think it needs to be dichotomous, but how do we navigate that very complex gray area between the two?
Well, yeah, I really do think in terms of what I do, in terms of the coaching side and the exercises that I prescribe, I would classify myself as a Luddite, to take, terminology that maybe James Smith would use, where, yes, I'm a little wary of technology in that respect. I love technology, though, as you know. Like, I like, messing around with different things, electronic things, and doing that. But as far as the coaching goes, I try to simplify. And maybe if like you said, if I'm limiting the degrees of freedom with the tools that I use, I have to be really good at using those 3 exercises or 4 things. And then there's the nuances of, if I'm going to use this drill, maybe there's different ways that I convey the information for that drill or the cues, and to get the desired response, rather than going, oh, geez, that didn't work, let's try this other one, and then you just sweep back and forth, and you never really get any progress. So I think I have this low-level anxiety when I coach, where I'm thinking, I don't know if I can do this, and I think it's helpful. Like, if you think I know everything, then you're going to miss stuff. But if you have this sort of neurotic behavior when you coach, I think it makes you find the result more easily in the long run because you're persistent, you're patient, and you want to get it right. And by choosing only a few things, a few elements to work on, now you really got to focus. And at the end of those sessions, my head was hurting because I think I was really trying to solve it with just a few things. And it did work out pretty good. But during the process, I'm like, oh, okay, it's not really working the way I want it to. Relax, take a few deep breaths, let's work through it. And we started to get results because you can't expect human beings to be able to just flip a switch and change their behavior. And that's something that I've learned just through trial and error and tinkering. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's certainly an art to using that approach and exploring it on the softer side and the human side. And I think that's what, if we do get into actually training people to be trainers, that's the part that excites me, is teaching them how to do that, because it's not easy. You can't read off a script. You actually have to use your senses, and that's probably the most exciting part for me.
Yeah, no, where I struggle with this whole conversation is, like, now we have things like GPS that can measure how far and how fast and the extent to which people change direction in a game, but we assume that, like the volume or the intensity of those movements is all that matters, when if you track all those things but you're not concerned with how it's executed, so the how versus the what, I think that, like, it's not, these things don't exist in a vacuum. So running 4,000 meters in a soccer game, the way that you're teaching running, I would argue, has a lower cost than running 4,000 meters in a different way. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be tracking these volumes and intensities and loads, but if we're not paying attention to how they're being executed, then maybe we wouldn't be so concerned with load management if we were more efficient with our movements. And I'm sure that at some point there's going to be a better way to measure and quantify efficiency of movement. But until that happens, coaching is really hard, and trial and error is hard, because you have to fail and you have to try something new and fail again until you get the result that you want. I think in a lot of ways it's easier to just measure data and put numbers in a spreadsheet and say, okay, well, like, here's the picture, and we're going to base our interventions on these numbers, versus behavioral change, which running as a behavior is much more difficult to implement, right, than just saying, okay, well, because changing how you run is so difficult, we're just going to monitor your volume and intensity, when obviously you need to be doing all those things. But I think in a lot of ways, the simplest thing and the most obvious thing, which is how people run, or altering that in a way that's going to have a lower orthopedic cost or structural cost, is the hardest thing to actually do. Maybe that's why people shy away from it, right? Because it's like with sleep, right? Like, you can track sleep. Everyone knows that sleep is good, so you can track sleep, and if people need to track it to hold themselves accountable to sleep more, but for the most part, lack of information and quantification isn't the issue when it comes to sleep. It's getting to bed and developing good habits, and I think that's what you're trying to instill with what you do, but there's so many interpersonal factors that relate to that I think is just difficult. So anything that you want to add on kind of the whole, quantifying versus behavioral change? 'Cause I think that your kind of bias is more towards the behavioral change and execution side of things, as is mine, but maybe there's something I'm missing, and maybe, like, you can point out something where it's, like I said, I could possibly be missing something and be a little bit too far in the other direction.
Well, a perfect example is, like, I wear this Ready Band from Fatigue Science to measure my sleep. And I know I'm not sleeping well while I'm here, but there's reasons behind that, and there is a behavior part. And my behavior is I want to do as much as I can while I'm here, because there's a lot of good people I can work with, and that's the sacrifice I'm making. That's the decision I've made, and I can track my sleep and go, oh, I'm averaging 4.5 hours per night. That's not great, but I understand that's a trade-off. And then I can go back and I can use that to support what I already know. Mm-hmm. But if I'm working blind and I'm ignorant and I'm not aware, and then I have to use that to tell me that I'm engaging in this behavior, I think it's bad. Like, I would think that if I was a head coach, which I would never be, but if I was a head coach, I would, use my awareness and my knowledge of the game to determine where maybe we had, injuries, or we fallen off in our play, or something else. This, some aspects of the game, and then go back and say, okay, this is what my hunch is on this. Can you provide me with the data on our load data or how much we practiced, so that I can support maybe what I think is going on? Or we had all these injuries. Is there something that can support that from the movement data, the sleep, whatever? But it's collected in the background so that if I have to go back to my records and check, just like you have your financial information or any sort of data that you collect, it's there for somebody to go back and confirm maybe what they're already thinking, or maybe to change their mind. But it's not like somebody's feeding the head coach the report and then he's going to make changes based on the data that's handed to him. It has to be that kind of awareness process on the part of the coach to be willing to use the data to change his behavior that he knows that might need to be changed based on what he's seeing on the field. And I don't know if anybody's doing that.
Yeah.
I think what happens is the GPS guy sends his report in, and then maybe the coach is kind of like, oh, that's interesting, but there's no connection in terms of the value of that information and the decision making that should take or that will take place. I don't think anybody's doing that. Maybe they are, and they're keeping it secret. But I think the majority of teams are just collecting it to show that they're collecting it, right? And
Right.
It's not influencing behavior. It's in spite of whatever behavior needs to be changed. So that's my thought. Hopefully, I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think a lot of different fields are struggling with the same thing, because you're talking about sport coaching, but even in physical therapy, there's a huge emphasis on gait labs and like Alter G treadmills and running. And I've been to some of these places where, it's so sophisticated. They have force plates, and for people who are coming off an injury, they can, alter the gravitation, the gravity in the treadmill to make people effectively weigh less. And so there's less of a structural cost when they're running. And they can use the force plate to say, yeah, you've got an asymmetry in your foot strike, and they can quantify every aspect of the running action, but they never actually change how people run, and they never say, how do you make it better?
Yeah.
So this information's not bad, because I think that there is a place for saying, okay, we need to be able to take what our eyes show us and hold ourselves accountable or keep ourselves honest with data that we can quantify and measure. But if we just take that data, like you're saying, and then we don't do anything with it, it's like, okay, you can ramp somebody up post-injury using an Alter G, but if the impetus for their injury maybe was, an issue with their foot strike, just making the foot strike less consequential on that treadmill isn't going to help them when they go back to running on concrete, right? So, and I've been to a lot of these like really sophisticated gait labs, and I've really never seen, literally never, any just basic drilling and trial and error where it's like, okay, well, this is what we found. Because I love what you did where you had people who were overstriding. That tends to be what you see the most in sprinting.
Yep.
And you gave them drills where it was all about frequency at a much higher frequency than they'd actually run. Mm-hmm. But they do these drills, they go to the opposite extreme, and then when you tell them to run, they kind of meet somewhere in the middle. Yep. But there was very little of that, even in my physical therapy education. It was, they can quantify every joint angle when it comes to the running action, whether it's at the knee, the ankle, or the hip. And they would say, well, these are the norms for running, and you're deviating from the norms. But it's like, all right, well, how do I... Obviously, there's no optimal technique, but I think we can use normative data as a starting point. But no one ever told these people, okay, well, here's how to achieve things that look more normal, right? So it's your approach is appreciated, because I think that you respect the technological aspect, but like that people want to, I think, sometimes evade responsibility for having to coach and think and tinker and fail, because coaching involves failure.
Yeah.
And you want to speak to, how many mistakes that you've made, even now, right? After doing this for so many years,
yeah.
I don't know. What's the role of failure in all this? And uncertainty.
It's huge. I think it drives, at least it drives me to get better, and it drives me to search out for the best solutions. Whereas, if you're having success all the time, or you're perceiving that you're having success, or you're the reason why people are succeeding, I think you start to that's when you'll trip, and that's when you'll miss something. And maybe you don't have to be neurotic and overly self-critical, but it's also good to surround yourself with people who are supportive of you, supportive emotionally, psychologically, and all that, but also aren't afraid to say hey, I think you might have missed something, right? Or I see this a little differently, And that's what's great about hanging around people like yourself, is that you're going to tell me if you think you have a different point of view, and you're going to do it in a nice way. But I appreciate that you can give me a different perspective, and that it forces me to learn more. I don't have to be the expert that you are, but I certainly have a new perspective upon which to, kind of weigh things now.
Yeah. So you obviously have your hand in a lot of different pots. What projects are you up to now? What's interesting to you? And then how can people learn more about you before we wrap it up?
Well, I'm really working on this website, sprintcoach.com, where it's going to be very resource-based, and obviously, you can buy some things, but I want it to be a connection point for people where they can go and say, hey, I want to learn more about how to sprint, how to run well, and if I can't afford it, I can still get really good information, but also ultimately use it as a way to connect people in real time. And I don't know how that's going to work, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. But how do we connect professionals, like-minded people, to help solve problems in a real-time sense, where we jump on and people can go, hey, this is what I had. What do you guys think of this? And then maybe even have some sort of educational component to it, where you're bridging a gap between what happened to somebody academically and getting them to a point where practically they feel more comfortable, with using the information that we provide. So, that's big for me now. Is I'm not saying that I've coached enough, but I've coached a lot, and you try to weigh where your value is going to, be best spent. And I think sharing information and going, hey, this is what I see. I think right now that's where I'm trying to push. And I have some stuff coming up in February and March, working, doing presentations for the NFL, and that's not an end goal, but it certainly is a good way to kind of test your theories and go, hey, what do you guys think of this? This is what I think. You guys are kind of working in, isolation here. That I want to try to bring a new perspective, because a lot, as people just tend to do what they've always done, and I'm not there to kind of shake things up in a negative way. I'm trying there to get them to think outside of the normal way of thinking. So.
All right, very cool. Well, thanks so much for your time, and I'll put any pertinent links in the notes here. I've been lucky to have these conversations with you the last few weeks, and it's nice to finally record one so we can share some of your insight. So yeah, thanks again, and look forward to chatting soon.
Likewise, thank you for having me on.